Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the most dramatic and mysterious aspects of Viking culture, the curious rituals surrounding their ship burials. Imagine it, a vast, towering ship, lit by flickering torches, its stern pointed toward the distant horizon as the deceased Viking, adorned in treasure, embarks on a journey into the afterlife. You probably won't survive this. Seriously. In the world of Viking burials, it's not about a cozy pillow and a peaceful nap. It's about grand spectacle, fire, and the belief that a grand journey awaits those who deserve it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Vikings, those rugged warriors from Scandinavia, were not only fearsome in battle but also profoundly ritualistic in death. Their beliefs surrounding the afterlife were rich with symbolism, and none of these rituals was more breathtaking than the practice of ship burials. This was not just about burying a body, oh no. For the Vikings, this was an elaborate send-off to the other side. And if you were lucky or important enough, your journey to the afterlife might just involve a grand ship, set aflame and sent out to sea, or sometimes buried in the earth like a long-forgotten treasure. Why a ship though? You may wonder. Well, for the Vikings, ships represented much more than just a means of transport. They were a symbol of power, adventure, and the ability to cross into unknown realms. They saw their ships as gateways, not only for exploring the physical world but also for entering the spiritual one. And this wasn't just a simple, somber burial. Oh no, it was a bold, fiery, and sometimes downright dramatic affair that could include everything from treasure-laden graves to epic funeral pyres. Think of it like the final act in an old myth, where gods, heroes, and warriors all come together for one last journey. As we ease into tonight's story, imagine yourself at the edge of one of these grand burials, looking out over the sea, feeling the cold wind against your skin, hearing the crackle of fire. It's a ceremony that promised not just death, but an adventure in the afterlife, a journey fit for a Viking warrior. The stage is set, and this is only the beginning. As the wind brushes against your face, the scene becomes clearer. A Viking ship, majestic and filled with the weight of centuries of tradition, waits to carry its occupant into the afterlife. The significance of these ships in Viking culture cannot be overstated. They were not merely vessels for sea voyages. They symbolized the very essence of life, death, and everything in between. Picture it, the long, sleek body of the ship, gleaming in the twilight as the oars creak and the sail flutters gently in the breeze. The ship wasn't just a practical tool, it was the very embodiment of a Viking's passage through life and into eternity. These ships were the means by which the Vikings believed they would travel to the afterlife, especially to the great halls of Valhalla, where warriors who died bravely in battle were honored. The Viking afterlife was a place of eternal feasting and fighting, and a warrior who earned a ship burial was thought to be worthy of the highest honors. This wasn't about being gently laid to rest in a quiet plot of earth. No, this was about sending off someone with the full honor they had earned during their lifetime. To be placed aboard a ship meant that you had accomplished something remarkable, something worthy of a journey fit for gods. Historians still debate the exact reasoning behind choosing ships for burials. Some say it was simply the Vikings' deep connection to the sea, a place where they had spent most of their lives as sailors and raiders. The ocean was their home, their lifeline, their very identity. But others believed there was a spiritual dimension to the choice. Ships, to the Vikings, were not just for travel. They were sacred, believed to be able to carry the deceased to other realms. The act of setting the ship alight, or even burying it whole, could have been a way to ensure that the deceased soul would be guided safely on its journey. In some ways, the Vikings' choice of ships for burials makes perfect sense. After all, they were explorers at heart, always seeking new lands, new challenges. In death, they sought to continue that journey, traveling to places beyond this world. and the ship was their ultimate tool for such a voyage. If you're envisioning this burial ceremony, think of it as the grandest of send-offs. The Viking ship was the final stage for someone who had lived a life full of adventure, battles, and feasts. But not just any ship would do. Oh no, the ships chosen for burials were special. They were often meticulously built, their designs reflecting the skill and artistry of the Viking craftsmen. The hulls were carved with intricate designs, perhaps telling stories of the sea, of battles fought, or gods worshipped. And as the ceremony unfolded, these ships would become the focal point of a dramatic and ceremonial journey, a journey that would send the deceased toward the horizon of the afterlife. Now let's take a closer look at the ships themselves. These weren't just any vessels you'd find in a typical Viking fleet. The ships chosen for burials were often large, majestic, and symbolic in their own right. Imagine, if you will, a long ship, sleek, with a dragon or serpent-shaped prow, its wooden hull decorated with intricate carvings that tell tales of gods, men, and the sea itself. The Vikings didn't just sail in these ships, they revered them. To be buried in one was no small honor, and the craftsmanship involved in creating a ship burial was absolutely remarkable. The ships used in burials were often constructed with care, and not just any old ship would do. The vessels used for burials were considered sacred. They were sometimes especially built for the purpose of the burial, crafted with precision to ensure that the deceased had a truly grand voyage. These ships were designed to withstand the elements, to carry the body and the riches into the afterlife. They were also symbols of the deceased's status. A warrior of high rank would likely have a grander, more decorated ship, while those of lower status might be buried in smaller, simpler vessels. But even these simpler ships had their own significance, representing the Viking belief that no one should be left without a means of crossing into the next world. Historians still argue whether the size or decoration of the ship was more important than the actual journey it represented. Some scholars suggest that the intricacy of the ship's design might have been meant to impress the gods, signaling the deceased's readiness for an eternal voyage. Others believe that the vessel's very shape, long, sharp, and sleek, symbolized a kind of strength and speed that would carry the deceased swiftly across realms. This connection between the ship's physical attributes and the journey to the afterlife cannot be overstated. The longships were built to withstand storms, to cut through the waves with precision, much like the Viking soul was expected to cut through the barriers between life and death. As we dive deeper into these vessels, we must also consider their symbolic significance beyond just transportation. The longship, with its curved and elegant form, represented the Viking way of life itself, bold, fast, and ever-moving. The ships were more than just physical vehicles. They were the vessels of life and death, carrying their occupants not only through the seas but into the great unknown. When the ship was finally loaded with the deceased, adorned with treasures, weapons, and sometimes even animals, it became a moving tribute to a life well lived and an honor well deserved. The idea of placing someone in a ship to send them off to the afterlife also reflects the Viking belief in the importance of the journey. Whether you were a warrior headed to Valhalla, an explorer bound for a new world, or just a person who had lived a good, noble life, the Viking ship burial made sure that your final journey would be as grand as the life you had lived. So, who exactly was given the honor of a ship burial? Well, as you might guess, it wasn't just anyone who could expect such a magnificent send-off. Ship burials were reserved for the high-ranking, the esteemed, and the elite in Viking society. A noble warrior, a powerful chieftain, or someone who had achieved greatness in battle, these were the individuals who were most likely to be given a ship burial. But that's not all. If you were lucky or simply important enough, your ship burial would not only involve the vessel itself but also a plethora of treasures, weapons, and sometimes even human or animal sacrifices to accompany you on your journey. The idea here was clear. A person of significant standing, someone who had lived a life full of glory, was worthy of a burial befitting their achievements. Vikings held their warriors and leaders in high esteem, and those who had proved themselves on the battlefield were granted an afterlife that reflected that. But ship burials were not just about the social standing of the individual. They were about the legacy that person left behind, the impact they had made, the way they shaped Viking society. It wasn't just the dead who mattered in Viking burials, the living played a role too. The ceremonies surrounding ship burials were meant to demonstrate the importance of the deceased, to honor their achievements, and to ensure their memory would live on for future generations. But historians still debate whether it was purely military accomplishment that earned a ship burial, or if the individual's ability to lead, strategize, or create wealth for their people could also play a role in such a momentous occasion. Some argue that ship burials were primarily for warriors and leaders, while others believe that any individual who made a significant contribution to their community, be it through trade, leadership, or diplomacy, might have been eligible. After all, Viking society was complex, with its own set of rules and values, and the importance of an individual was measured by a variety of factors, not just their ability to fight. It's likely that this debate will continue among scholars for years to come. The Viking worldview was one that placed great importance on honor, respect, and legacy. Ship burials were a way of ensuring that those who had earned such respect would be remembered, and would have a glorious transition into the afterlife. But what about the rest of the Viking population? Were they denied such honors? Not exactly. While the grandest ship burials were reserved for the elite, it's believed that ordinary Vikings had their own forms of burial that still reflected their warrior culture. However, for the high-ranking individuals, nothing less than a majestic ship would do. Now, let's focus on the preparation of the body, which was no simple task. In Viking culture, death was not something that could be taken lightly. It was a monumental event, and the body needed to be prepared with the utmost care before embarking on its final journey. The Vikings believed that the deceased would need to be equipped for their voyage to the afterlife, much like a sailor preparing for a long and treacherous journey. Imagine the scene. The body is carefully dressed in its finest clothes, sometimes adorned with jewelry and armor, ready to face the trials of the unknown. Historians still argue over how exactly the body was prepared for burial, with some suggesting that elaborate embalming rituals were used, while others believe that the Vikings simply relied on natural preservation methods. Some sources mention that the Vikings would have the body washed and dressed in ceremonial garments, while others hint at more elaborate practices, such as placing the body in a seated position, as if ready to sail into the next world. The body was also often accompanied by weapons, food, and items that the deceased might need in the afterlife: swords, shields, and sometimes even horses, all placed alongside the body in the ship. But beyond just the body's physical preparation, there was also the spiritual aspect to consider. For the Vikings, death wasn't the end, it was simply a transition. As the body was prepared, rituals would be conducted to ensure that the deceased spirit was ready for the journey. These rituals could involve offerings to the gods, chants, and prayers, all designed to help the soul find its way to the afterlife. The Vikings believed in a host of gods and spirits who could guide the deceased to their final resting place, whether that was the Hall of Valhalla or some other world. In fact, the entire process was as much about the spirit's journey as it was about the body's physical transition. As the body was placed on the ship, the deceased would often be surrounded by treasures and personal belongings, symbolic of the wealth and status they had accumulated in life. These objects weren't just for show, they were meant to assist the soul on its journey. After all, you wouldn't want to show up at your final destination without your sword or your shield, right? These items were meant to provide protection and comfort in the afterlife, a kind of spiritual insurance policy. The presence of these objects reflected the Viking belief in a life after death that was not too different from the one they had left behind. Only now the stakes were higher. Now imagine you're watching this ritual unfold. The body is laid out in the ship, surrounded by treasures and offerings. The atmosphere is thick with incense and solemnity, and the air is charged with anticipation. This isn't just a burial, it's the final voyage of a warrior, a leader, a person who had lived a life that deserved to be marked by such a grand event. The body, the treasures, and the rituals all come together to create a moment that is as profound as it is awe-inspiring. But the journey isn't over yet. What happens next is perhaps the most dramatic aspect of the entire ceremony. Now that the body is prepared, adorned, and surrounded by treasures, the ceremony itself can begin. This wasn't just a quiet, somber event, it was a grand spectacle. Picture yourself there. The ship resting on the shore, the sails unfurled, its wooden frame gleaming under the light of torches. The air is thick with the scent of smoke, the sounds of chants echoing from the crowd, and the flicker of flames casting dancing shadows across the faces of the onlookers. The scene is part reverence, part ritual, and completely charged with energy. The Vikings took this moment seriously. This was not only a goodbye, but also the start of a grand journey for the deceased. Historians still debate the exact order of the Viking burial rituals, but one thing is certain. It was a ceremony that could last for hours, sometimes even days. The deceased would often be placed on the ship in a seated position, as though ready to set sail for the afterlife. This was a carefully choreographed event, with each step having its own meaning. The ship was not just a physical vehicle. It was a spiritual one, designed to carry the soul of the deceased across the Great Divide. As the ship was set aflame or pushed into the sea, the crowd would watch in silence, waiting for the flames to carry their loved one to their final resting place. There are varying accounts of what exactly took place during the ritual. Some suggest that the ship would be burned either on land or at sea, in a fire that symbolized the final separation between life and death. The flames in this context were seen as a purifying force, a way to cleanse the soul of any earthly attachments. Others argue that the ship was left intact, buried in the ground with the deceased inside, ensuring that the body would rest in the vessel that had been their vehicle during life. In either case, the ritual was intended to ensure that the deceased's journey into the afterlife was as grand as their life had been. One fascinating detail that scholars continue to debate is the role of the funeral pyre in Viking burials. Was it meant to send the soul to the afterlife, or was it simply a way to dispose of the body? Some argue that the flames represented the Viking belief in the cyclical nature of life and death. Nothing ever truly ends, but instead transforms into something new. This could explain the choice of fire, as it both consumed and transformed, taking the soul from one world and sending it into another. Others, however, point out that the fire was just as much about spectacle and symbolism as it was about function. It was a way to make a grand statement about the importance of the person being buried. Whatever the specific details of the burial ceremony, the act of setting the ship ablaze, or sending it off to sea, was the climactic moment. It was the final act of a life lived with purpose, a life that would be remembered for years to come. The Vikings were not a people to let death go unnoticed. They ensured that the deceased would be honored, their legacy immortalized through fire, ship, and ceremony. As the flames flickered and the ship burned, you could almost feel the energy of the moment, the weight of history, the passage of time, and the belief that this ritual was not just about death, but about the continuation of a journey. As the flames of the Viking ship burial flicker and dance across the night, something even more profound happens. The deceased is not only surrounded by fire and ritual, but by treasures and sacred objects placed alongside them. These grave goods, a mix of weapons, food, personal items, and sometimes even animals, served as companions for the journey ahead. This wasn't just about honoring the deceased, it was about preparing them for their life after death, an afterlife in which they would need their worldly possessions to continue their journey. Imagine the scene now, piles of precious items laid carefully around the body, gleaming in the firelight, ready to accompany the deceased to their next life. Weapons were often the most prominent items placed with the deceased. For the Vikings, warriors were defined by their weapons, swords, axes, and shields that had seen many battles. These weren't just items to be left behind. They were symbols of the person's strength and status, tools that would help them fight and defend themselves in the afterlife. Some graves even contained full sets of armor or weapons, a reflection of the importance placed on these items in Viking society. After all, to a Viking, a warrior was only as good as their weapon. But the offerings didn't stop at weapons. Food, too, was a common inclusion in these burial rituals. The Vikings believed that their dead would need sustenance for their journey, and so they often buried their deceased with food and drink, sometimes even their favorite meals. There's something quite touching in this act. Picture it, a feast fit for a Viking warrior, laid beside them to ensure that they would never go hungry in the afterlife. It's a symbolic gesture for sure, but also a deeply practical one in the Viking worldview, where every necessity, even in death, was thought to be vital for survival. Historians still debate the symbolic importance of these grave goods. Were the weapons and food meant to ensure that the deceased was prepared for whatever came next, or were they offerings to the gods? Some scholars believe that the grave goods were meant to accompany the deceased on their journey to the afterlife, acting as tools or provisions for the challenges ahead. Others argue that these items were offerings to the gods, ensuring that the deceased would receive favor in the afterlife. Either way, the message was clear. The Vikings believed that death was not the end, but a continuation of their journey. And in this belief, the items left behind weren't just tokens of remembrance. They were necessary tools for the soul's survival. Animals, too, were sometimes included in the burial. The Vikings believed that animals could help guide the soul to the afterlife, much like they might have guided the deceased during their life. Horses were commonly placed in Viking graves, and some burials even included dogs. In these cases, the animals were likely seen as loyal companions both in life and in death. The role of animals in Viking burials ties back to their belief in the interconnectedness of all living things, humans, animals, and spirits, all playing a role in the eternal journey. Now imagine standing beside the ship, watching as these items are carefully arranged around the body. The treasures and weapons, the food and the animals, all are placed to ensure that the deceased's journey will be as complete as possible. This wasn't just about giving someone a send-off, it was about preparing them for what came next. And when that ship was set alight or pushed into the sea, all of these items, these tokens of life, death and beyond, went with them, ensuring that the deceased would not face the unknown alone. As the final flames of the ship's burial flicker and the treasures dissolve into smoke, there's one more striking element of Viking funerary practices to explore: the ritual of fire itself. Viking ship burials, especially those that involved cremation, often revolved around fire in profound ways. Imagine the flickering light of the pyre reflecting on the faces of the mourners, the crackling sound as the wood and offerings are consumed by the flames. Fire, to the Vikings, was more than just a method of disposing of the body, it was a sacred act, one that symbolized transformation and transition. Historians still debate the full spiritual meaning of the fire in Viking burials. Some scholars argue that fire was seen as a purifying element, capable of removing the soul from the physical world and sending it on its way to the afterlife. The Vikings believed in a cyclical view of life and death. Nothing was truly gone, only transformed into something new. In this context, the fire could have been thought of as a catalyst for that transformation, purging the physical body and allowing the spirit to move freely into the next world. This is why fire was such an essential part of Viking burials. It represented the final separation from the world of the living and the beginning of a new journey. But not all Viking burials involved cremation. Some were simpler, with the body laid to rest in the ship and buried, sometimes with the ship itself intact. The cremation or burning of the ship, however, was the more dramatic and awe-inspiring option. The ritual of setting the ship ablaze might have been a way to honor the deceased's achievements, but it was also a way to ensure that the body and spirit were sufficiently released from the earthly realm. The flames were believed to carry the soul beyond the boundaries of the living world, into the unknown expanses of the afterlife. There's also the practical side to consider. The Vikings, living as they did in harsh, cold climates, relied heavily on fire for survival. It was their source of warmth, their method of cooking, and their means of lighting the dark. So, it's no surprise that they would incorporate fire into their most sacred rituals. By setting the ship ablaze, they were also engaging with something deeply familiar to them, a force that had sustained them through life and would continue to accompany them through death. It's this intimate relationship with fire that made it such a fitting vehicle for their beliefs about the afterlife. But what about the idea of sending the ship out to sea? Was it merely symbolic, or did it serve a more practical function? Some scholars believe that sending the ship into the water, perhaps to drift away and sink, was a way to ensure that the deceased would reach the afterlife safely. This ritual too was filled with meaning, as it mirrored the journeys the Vikings had taken in life, exploring distant lands and unknown shores. The journey across the seas was one of the most important aspects of the Viking worldview. And so, setting the ship on the water, watching it fade into the distance, was a way of showing the deceased the same respect they had shown the oceans and the unknown during their lifetimes. As the ship drifts out of view, the flames die down, and the mourners begin to disperse. There's a sense that the deceased has truly embarked on a journey beyond this world. The Vikings understood that death was not an end, but a passage. And fire, the flames of the pyre, the smoke rising into the sky, was the guide, the catalyst, and the final farewell. It's a deeply poignant, almost mystical moment, one that speaks to the Vikings' belief in both the physical and spiritual realms, where both realms must be traversed to reach eternal rest. Now, as we continue to unravel the depths of Viking ship burials, it's time to take a closer look at the objects that accompanied the deceased. These grave goods were not just material possessions. They were powerful symbols, each item carefully selected to ensure that the deceased had everything they might need in the afterlife. Picture the ship once more, a gleaming vessel surrounded by weapons, jewelry, food, and even animals. Each item placed in the ship was an extension of the person's life, a reflection of who they were, what they valued, and what they would need as they journeyed into the unknown. Weapons, naturally, were a dominant feature in Viking grave goods. The Vikings, after all, were known for their warrior culture. A sword, axe, or shield was much more than just a tool for battle. It was a symbol of honor, strength, and prowess. To be buried with weapons was to show that the deceased had earned their place among the ranks of the greatest warriors. Some of the most impressive ship burials included entire sets of armor, crafted with exquisite care, reflecting the warrior's status and skill. These weapons weren't just decorative, they were practical tools that would accompany the deceased on their journey to the afterlife, ensuring that they would be ready to face whatever challenges awaited. But Viking ship burials weren't just about weapons. They were about ensuring the deceased's comfort and well-being in the afterlife. And that's where food and drink came in. It might sound strange, but the Vikings believed that the dead would need nourishment on their journey to the afterlife. As a result, the deceased were often buried with food and drink, including bread, meat, and even mead or ale. These offerings were meant to ensure that the deceased would not go hungry during their travels, and that they would have everything they needed to sustain them in the next world. Historians still debate the significance of these items. Were they purely practical, meant to provide for the deceased in the afterlife, or were they symbolic, meant to ensure that the deceased would have a comfortable and fulfilling journey? Some scholars argue that the presence of food and drink in the burial shows the Vikings' belief in an afterlife where life continues much like it did on Earth, complete with meals, feasts, and fellowship. Others, however, suggest that these offerings were simply a way to demonstrate respect for the deceased, ensuring that they had everything they needed for their eternal rest. But there were also more personal items included in these burials, things that reflected the deceased's unique personality. Jewelry, for example, was often buried with the deceased, perhaps as a symbol of the person's status or wealth, but also as a mark of their individuality. The Vikings were skilled artisans, and their jewelry was often finely crafted, with intricate designs that reflected both their personal tastes and the cultural values of their society. These items weren't just for show, they were meant to accompany the deceased as a reminder of their life and the mark they left on the world. In some cases, animals were also included in the burial, typically horses or dogs. The inclusion of animals in Viking burials reflects the belief that animals could assist the soul in its journey to the afterlife, just as they had in life. Horses were particularly important, as they symbolized strength, loyalty, and the ability to navigate the physical world. The Vikings believed that by including animals in the burial, they were ensuring that the deceased would have loyal companions to guide them on their final journey. Now, imagine the ship in full, filled to the brim with weapons, food, jewelry, and animals, all carefully arranged around the body. This wasn't just a burial, it was an entire world prepared for the deceased's next chapter. The ship wasn't just a place for the body, it was a microcosm of the life that had been lived and the journey that was about to begin. These grave goods weren't merely objects. They were companions, symbols, and provisions for the soul as it ventured into the afterlife. As we gaze upon the grandeur of Viking ship burials and the treasures laid out beside the deceased, one inevitable question arises. Where exactly are these sacred ship burials located? Viking ship burials, while once common, are now some of the most famous and debated archaeological finds in the world. Their discovery has shed light on the Vikings' complex burial practices, offering us glimpses into a world of warrior rituals and the transition from life to death. Imagine standing on the shores of Scandinavia, the wind heavy with the scent of salt water, looking out at the spot where a Viking ship, filled with treasures, was once set ablaze, watching it sail away into the horizon, its flames flickering into the dark. The most famous Viking ship burial site is perhaps the Oseberg ship burial, discovered in Norway in 1904. This site is remarkable not only because it contained an entire ship, but also because of the quality and variety of the grave goods found within. The Oseberg ship was discovered in a burial mound, and it was filled with rich offerings, furniture, animals, textiles, and even the remains of two women. Historians are still divided on who these women were. Some believe they were important female leaders, possibly queens or priestesses, while others think they might have been servants or companions. Regardless, their presence in the burial suggests a significant ritual importance, emphasizing the Viking belief in the continuation of status and wealth beyond the grave. Another significant burial site is the Gokstad ship burial, also in Norway, which dates to around 900 CE. Like the Oseberg ship, the Gokstad ship was placed in a burial mound and filled with grave goods. However, this ship burial was quite different. It was intended for a male warrior or leader. The ship itself was nearly 23 meters long and was found with weapons, tools, and other goods that a warrior might need in the afterlife. The Gokstad ship is perhaps the best example of the Viking ideal of a warrior's journey to the afterlife, equipped with everything needed to continue their heroic endeavors in the world beyond. Interestingly, ship burials were not restricted to Norway. Sites in Denmark and Sweden also contain evidence of Viking ship burials, though these ships are often smaller and less ornate than those in Norway. For instance, the famous Jelling ship burial, discovered in Denmark, contained a mound with remnants of a ship, though no complete vessel was found. This suggests that ship burials were practiced more widely across Scandinavia, though the grandeur of the burial depended largely on the deceased's social status. While Norway might have been the epicenter of the grand ship burials, the practice certainly spanned beyond its borders, offering a glimpse into the interconnectedness of Viking societies. These burial sites are incredibly significant, not just for what they reveal about Viking practices, but also for what they tell us about Viking society and their belief systems. The discovery of these ship burials has allowed historians to piece together the Viking worldview, with the burial sites acting as a sort of portal into the past. They show us how the Vikings viewed life and death, and how they believed their honored dead should be treated. For the Vikings, death wasn't an end, it was another journey, another adventure. And just as they journeyed across oceans in life, they were buried in ships that would carry them across the spiritual seas in death. Now, imagine standing at one of these burial mounds today. The landscape is quiet, serene, and steeped in history. The mounds, though weathered by time, still hold the echoes of the Viking past, and it's not hard to imagine the grandeur of the funeral rites that once took place. The burial sites, like the people they honor, have left an indelible mark on history, reminding us of the Vikings' lasting legacy in both life and death. The Viking ship burials, with their treasures and ceremonial grandeur, inevitably inspired a swirl of myths and legends that have lingered throughout history. These burials, imbued with rich symbolism and mystery, became fertile ground for storytelling. Over time, the Viking ship burial ritual evolved into an almost mythical event, one so steeped in ritual and grandeur that it's no surprise it has captured the imagination of people across generations. Imagine standing by a Viking ship burial, watching it being set alight, the flames rising into the dark sky, and thinking, could there be a deeper, more spiritual connection between the living and the dead? The myths surrounding Viking ship burials are, in many ways, as grand and dramatic as the burials themselves. One of the most enduring stories is that of the great warrior kings, such as those buried in the Oseberg and Gokstad ships. These men were believed to have been given a final, honorable send-off not just to the afterlife, but to a place where they would continue to fight, feast, and live forever in the halls of Valhalla. This belief in Valhalla, the Viking paradise, where the worthy warriors would fight and drink with Odin, was central to the burial process. And in some of the stories, it's not just the dead who are honored. There's an idea that their strength and courage are passed down to those still living. But there are also stories of sacrifice and tragedy. In some accounts, we hear of sacrifices being made during the burial, not just of animals but sometimes humans as well. Historians still argue about whether human sacrifices were ever a real part of Viking burial rituals, or whether it was a myth created by later storytellers. Some believe that the tales of human sacrifice were exaggerated to make Viking practices appear more brutal, while others suggest that it might have been a rare but real part of the burial process, symbolizing the deceased's importance and their elevated status. Another fascinating legend surrounds the idea of the ship burial being a journey across the seas. There are stories that claim the ships were set afloat with the body, the treasure, and everything needed for the journey to the next world. These stories often depict the ships being pushed out to sea, set aflame by the mourners as they watched from the shore. In these myths, the sea is a liminal space, a boundary between life and death, and the ship is a magical vessel, ferrying the deceased across to the realm of the gods. While these stories have been romanticized over the centuries, they are grounded in the Vikings' deep connection to the ocean and the afterlife, two realms that for them were never truly separate. Beyond the burials themselves, Viking sagas and poems have perpetuated the mystique of these grand ceremonies. One such saga, the Saga of the Inglings, tells the tale of a great warrior king's burial on a ship, and how the ship was set alight and sent drifting out into the sea to mark his passage into the afterlife. This story, like many others, combines historical elements with mythological embellishments, creating a lasting image of the Viking ship burial as a powerful symbol of the warrior's journey beyond death. Whether true or exaggerated, these myths add layers of meaning to the already complex burial rituals. In many ways, the legends surrounding Viking ship burials have transcended history and become a part of modern culture. The image of a Viking ship, ablaze and drifting out to sea, has been used in everything from Hollywood movies to fantasy novels. This mythic interpretation continues to influence how we view the Vikings today, wild, untamed, and forever connected to the sea. These stories are more than just a reflection of Viking burial practices. They are a testament to the lasting impact the Vikings have had on global culture. And yet, despite the myths, the true purpose of the ship burial remains grounded in reality. It was a profound ritual, designed to honor the dead and ensure that they were sent off with everything they needed for the journey ahead. The ships, the treasures, and the fire were all part of a belief system that combined the tangible and the spiritual. While we may never know exactly how much of the Viking ship burial was grounded in reality versus myth, it is clear that these rituals were an essential part of Viking identity, one that continues to captivate us to this day. As we continue exploring the Viking ship burials, we must address one of the most profound aspects of Viking culture: their views on the afterlife. Unlike many other ancient cultures, the Vikings did not see death as a final, irreversible event. For them, death was merely a transition, a passage from one world to another. The Vikings believed in several different realms, and the afterlife was not a one-size-fits-all destination. Their beliefs were steeped in mythology, and these beliefs shaped the rituals surrounding their ship burials. At the center of Viking afterlife beliefs was the idea of Valhalla, the great hall of the slain, where brave warriors who died in battle were honored. For the Vikings, Valhalla was not a peaceful rest, but an active, warrior-filled paradise. It was a place of endless feasting, drinking, and, of course, fighting. Those who were worthy enough to enter Valhalla would spend their afterlife engaging in heroic battle, only to rise the next day and do it all over again. To be buried in a ship was to be sent on a journey to this warrior's paradise, where one's soul could continue to fight and prove its valor for eternity. However, not all Viking souls were destined for Valhalla. Another important concept was Helheim, the land of the dead ruled over by the goddess Hel. This realm was less glorious and more somber than Valhalla, reserved for those who died of illness, old age, or other less honorable causes. Viking ship burials, especially those that were accompanied by elaborate offerings and rituals, were often associated with the journey to Valhalla, ensuring that the deceased would join the ranks of Odin's warriors. The belief was that a warrior's death in battle earned them a spot in Valhalla, and the ship burial was a means of ensuring they had the right tools for the journey ahead. Historians still debate the specifics of Viking beliefs about the afterlife. Was there a clear division between those who went to Valhalla and those who went to Helheim? Or were the distinctions more fluid, dependent on the specific tribe or community? Some scholars argue that the idea of Valhalla and Helheim was not as rigid as later texts suggest, and that Viking society may have had a more nuanced view of the afterlife, where the journey was less about winning favor with the gods and more about making one's own way into the next world. Still, the overarching belief in an afterlife, whether it was Valhalla, Helheim, or another realm, was integral to Viking culture and their burial practices. The ship burial, then, was not just a physical burial but a symbolic one. By placing the deceased in a ship, surrounded by their treasures, weapons, and other grave goods, the Vikings were giving them the means to navigate their afterlife. The ship acted as a vehicle to carry the soul across the realms, ensuring that the deceased would have what they needed for their journey. The burial was a way of honoring the individual's life and ensuring their safe passage into the afterlife, whether that meant joining Odin's warriors in Valhalla or resting peacefully in the realm of Hel. Imagine this scene: the ship burial with its treasures and solemnity is not just a goodbye. It's a gesture to the gods, a plea for favor, and a ritual designed to ensure that the deceased's journey would be smooth and their afterlife fulfilled. It's a moment that speaks to the Viking worldview, one that believed in the continuation of the soul, the importance of honor, and the significance of the afterlife. The Viking ship burial was not just about death, it was about the life that was to come. As we continue our exploration of Viking ship burials, we come to a fascinating point of debate among historians. What exactly did these burials symbolize? Were they purely ceremonial acts, or was there a deeper, more profound meaning behind the entire ritual? While the historical record provides us with some clarity, the truth is that scholars still argue about the exact significance of ship burials. Was the ship simply a means of transportation to the afterlife, or did it have a more complex spiritual or cultural meaning? One of the central discussions in this area is whether the Viking ship burials were exclusively for warriors or if they held a broader, more inclusive meaning. Some historians argue that these burials were primarily for warriors, those who had lived and died by the sword. The grand nature of the burial, the fire, the ship, and the treasures could be seen as a reflection of the deceased's importance as a fighter and a leader. After all, the Vikings were a warrior society, and their religion and culture were centered around honor, valor, and the afterlife rewards granted to those who fought bravely. Ship burials in this context would have been reserved for those who had earned the right to join Odin's Hall of Valhalla. However, others argue that Viking ship burials may have been more inclusive, extending beyond warriors to include other individuals of importance, be it rulers, shamans, or perhaps even prominent traders or craftsmen. While we know that the Vikings highly valued warriors, they were also a society with intricate social structures and a strong belief in the power of leadership in all its forms. The burial of a high-ranking chieftain or an influential figure could certainly warrant the same kind of grand, ceremonial send-off. Some Viking burials, like the ones in Gokstad and Oseberg, contained the remains of individuals who weren't necessarily warriors, suggesting that the practice might not have been solely reserved for battle-hardened fighters. Historians still debate whether ship burials were a reflection of social status or a sign of spiritual significance. The presence of numerous weapons, tools, and even horses in the burial site could indicate that the deceased were expected to need these items in the afterlife. In this sense, the burial wasn't just about honoring a warrior's status, it was about preparing them for the challenges of the next world. The presence of these items suggests a belief that the afterlife was just as complex and challenging as life itself. But does this mean the ship burial was solely functional? Or was it an expression of something more, something spiritual, tied to the Vikings' deeply held beliefs in gods, realms, and the passage between them? While historians argue over these points, the fact remains that Viking ship burials were a profound part of Viking culture. They were acts of reverence, ritual, and ceremony, designed to honor the dead and ensure their safe passage to the afterlife. Whether they were meant to reflect the warrior class, social status, or spiritual beliefs, one thing is clear. These burials were meant to be as grand and significant as the life lived by the deceased. As we contemplate these differing perspectives, we are reminded of how much remains unknown about Viking burial practices. The Viking world was one of complexity, mythology, and deep spirituality. The ship burial, in all its grandeur and mystery, is a powerful symbol of this world, a symbol of the intersection between life and death, honor and sacrifice, the physical world and the afterlife. It's a reminder that, despite our best efforts, there are still many questions left unanswered when it comes to the Vikings and their complex, ritualistic world. But in a way, that uncertainty only adds to the allure of the Viking ship burial, a ritual that continues to fascinate, mystify, and inspire us to this day. As the centuries passed, Viking ship burials gradually declined, giving way to simpler and less dramatic burial practices. So, why did this once grand ritual fall out of favor? There are several theories, and historians still debate the reasons behind the decline of the ship burial. One common theory is that the Viking Age, with its constant raids, exploration, and expansion, eventually gave way to more settled and less militaristic societies. As the Vikings began to settle down in the lands they had once raided, their society became more structured, with a stronger focus on agriculture, trade, and governance. The warrior elite, who had once been honored with grand ship burials, were now integrated into a more peaceful way of life. The transition from raiding to farming likely had a profound impact on Viking culture, and as society became more settled, the elaborate and costly nature of the ship burial became less practical. The elaborate ship burials, with their treasure-laden ships and elaborate rituals, were not only expensive but required considerable resources that were harder to come by as Viking society evolved. Moreover, as Christianity began to take root in Scandinavia, Viking burial practices started to change, reflecting the shift in religious beliefs. The ship burial, which had been tied to the old pagan gods, was gradually replaced by Christian burial practices, which were simpler and less focused on ritualistic grandeur. Historians still debate the role of Christianity in the decline of the ship burial. Some argue that the arrival of Christianity fundamentally altered Viking views on death and the afterlife, while others suggest that the changes in burial practices were more gradual, with the ship burial evolving rather than disappearing entirely. Regardless, It's clear that the decline of the ship burial reflects the larger changes occurring in Viking society during the transition from the Viking Age to the medieval period. As the Vikings shifted from warriors to farmers and traders, their burial practices followed suit, becoming more practical and less tied to their warrior culture. But despite this decline, Viking ship burials never fully disappeared from the historical imagination. The memory of these grand ceremonies, with their burning ships and treasure-filled graves, lived on in stories and myths. Over the centuries, the Viking ship burial evolved from a historical practice into a symbol of Viking greatness, a fitting tribute to a warrior culture that valued strength, honor, and the afterlife. The enduring legacy of Viking ship burials continues to captivate us today, inspiring books, films, and countless historical studies. And while the ritual itself may have faded away, the idea of the Viking warrior journeying to the afterlife aboard a magnificent ship has endured. It's a potent symbol of the Viking spirit, of adventure, courage, and the belief in life after death. The decline of the ship burial didn't mark the end of Viking traditions. Rather, it marked a transition, a shift from one era to another. And though the grand ship burials are no longer a part of our world, they remain a powerful reminder of the Vikings' rich and complex culture, their views on death and the afterlife, and the enduring legacy of their civilization. As we near the end of our exploration into the fascinating world of Viking ship burials, it's important to take a moment to reflect on the lasting legacy of these rituals. While the ship burials themselves may have faded into history, their cultural and symbolic influence continues to reverberate throughout the ages. The imagery of a Viking ship, ablaze and drifting out to sea, has become iconic, capturing the imagination of people from all walks of life, whether in books, movies, or even video games. The Viking ship burial, with all its grandeur, drama, and mysticism, continues to stand as a testament to a civilization that valued strength, honor, and a belief in the afterlife. The story of the Viking ship burial is, in many ways, a metaphor for the Vikings themselves. The ships, grand and purposeful, represent the boldness and ambition of a people who saw no boundaries in life or death. Just as the Vikings sailed across vast oceans in search of new lands, they believed their journey would continue after death, carried on the very ships that defined their way of life. These burials were not just about sending the deceased to the afterlife, they were about ensuring that their legacy would live on, that their story would continue to be told for generations to come. And in many ways it has. The Viking ship burial is more than just an archaeological relic. It's a symbol that transcends time. In modern culture, we see the Viking spirit embodied in everything from Norse mythology to popular depictions of Viking warriors. These warriors, once buried in ships and surrounded by treasure, are now immortalized in our collective imagination. The ship burial ritual, while rooted in the distant past, still captures the sense of adventure, fearlessness, and reverence for life and death that defined the Viking worldview. As you drift into the final stages of tonight's journey, think of the Viking ships that sailed across the seas and the shores where their burials took place. Imagine the flame flickering from the ship as it sets out, the journey not just of the body but of the spirit, forever voyaging into the afterlife. The Viking ship burial, while a practice of the past, serves as a reminder of how people long ago faced death with the same courage and ambition that they brought to life. With the passage of time, the grand spectacle of these burials might be relegated to history books and the pages of myths, but their influence lingers in the air like the smoke from a long-forgotten pyre. The Vikings, with their mighty ships, their treasures, and their powerful belief in an afterlife, left an indelible mark on history, a mark that continues to shape how we think about life, death, and the journey in between. As you settle into the quiet comfort of sleep tonight, perhaps you can take solace in the idea that, like the Vikings, your journey is only just beginning, even if it's one that's yet to be explored.